in the Department of Science and Technology Studies, jointly appointed in the Judith Rempe Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on Cornell University's campus, which is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayakono Cayuga Nation. The Gayakono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayakono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayakono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And now I'm very pleased to be welcoming Ashley Leeds, who is the Radoslav Sanoff Professor of Political Science at Rice University. I'm not sure I got that right.
Sounds great.
Hopefully he will forgive me. She is currently co-editor-in-chief of International Organization. Her research focuses on the design and effects of international agreements, particularly military alliances, and also on connections between domestic politics and foreign policy. She's co-author of Domestic Interests, Democracy, and Foreign Policy Change with Michaela Mates, I guess, which was published as a Cambridge Element in International Relations series in 2022. In 2008, Leeds received the Karl Deutsch Award from the International Studies Association, which is presented annually to a scholar in international relations within 10 years of PhD, who is judged to have made the most significant contribution to the study of international relations and peace research. And in 2019, she won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Conflict Processes section of APSA, American Political Science Association, in recognition of scholarly contributions that have fundamentally improved the study of conflict processes. So thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming Ashley. And I will moderate at the end, but I'm told that if you have intervening questions.
Yeah, particularly clarifying questions. Yeah, and if there's substantive questions, I may put them off until I finish, in case I'm going to explain it later. So I've rarely given a talk at a place like this where people have read the paper so carefully beforehand. So I worry a bit that this is going to be boring. But I will tell you that the talk is framed a little bit differently than the paper. We were just talking in a session I had with the lab, and I'm going to talk to grad students later this afternoon about publishing. The paper that you read is framed to be published as an independent article. But what I'm going to talk to you about today a little bit, because I think a lot of grad students and postdocs and everyone are interested in where do ideas come from and how do you get to where you end up in the end. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about my research program and where this fits in and how we got to this particular paper. And then I'm going to present the paper itself. I, of course, want to thank my co-authors. Jesse Johnson and Scott Wolford are both professors at the University of Texas. Connor Joyce is a PhD student at Rice. And this was very much a team effort. So the research program question is, how do governments use international security policy to help them counter internal threats and maintain domestic power? So this is something that I've been fundamentally interested in a while. I think that, in some sense, at least, we used to have this belief that foreign policy follows a national interest. And I think that varies from political system to political system, how much that's true. But I think most people accept now that politics doesn't stop at the water's edge, that there's a lot of domestic politics involved in foreign policy as well in virtually every system in the world. An assumption that many political scientists have found useful is that what leaders really want to do is they want to stay in power. Even if they have real policy beliefs, real ideological beliefs, they can only pursue those to the extent that they maintain power within their societies. And so leaders are trying to maintain power, and in doing so, they face both international threats and domestic threats. Frankly, a lot more people are removed because of domestic threats than because of international threats, right? I, for a long time, as you know, studied security policy and particularly military alliances. One of the things that I've observed in reading all these alliances over 200 years is how commonly domestic threats and domestic enemies, whether we're talking about sort of a 19th century discussion of revolutionaries or a current discussion of terrorists or subversives, appear in these international agreements, international military alliances. And a few years ago, I read Melissa Lee's book, which I think is a fantastic book, in which she talks about states using sort of destabilization in other states as a foreign policy strategy. And my immediate reaction to this was, I thought it was a brilliant book, but I thought governments aren't just going to sit around and let this happen. What are the governments of these states doing and how are they responding to that? So I really started to think about how it is that leaders of states use foreign policy, and particularly international security policy, to benefit them domestically. We know that in civil conflicts, governments have a lot of inherent advantages over rebel groups, right? This is why rebels so rarely win. And there are lots of domestic kinds of advantages that governments have over collective action and control of lots of things. But they also have a serious advantage over rebel groups in their ability to make credible and valuable international commitments. I'm not saying rebels never do this. There's a whole study of rebel diplomacy and rebels reaching out to foreign powers. But there's a big difference in what you can offer now, a tangible offer to other states, versus promises that depend on you winning, and then the incentives to fulfill those promises being present after you win. Even when rebels win, a lot of times there's shared governance, there are disputes among factions within rebel groups. So it's very hard for rebels to make credible commitments to foreign policy stances, whereas for current governments, that's a lot easier. And so what I am finding through this research program is that governments take advantage of this ability to make transactions, essentially, on the international stage to benefit them in their domestic conflict situations. So the first paper I wrote about this was published in IO in 2021, well before I became editor. And what it looks at is whether we can understand alliance formation not only as a response to international threats, but as a response to domestic threats. And relevant, there's a lot of other things in the paper, but relevant to the study that we're talking about today, what we found is that states that have what we call a latent domestic threat, sort of transnational ethnic kin that are excluded ethnic groups who have transnational ethnic kin are likely to try to form non-aggression and neutrality pacts with other states to keep them from intervening in their conflicts. We followed that up in 2024 with another paper published in ISQ that's about how allies behave during civil conflicts. And what we find is that despite the clear selection effects, even though we know that states are more likely to form non-aggression pacts with states that are likely to be in conflict with them, we still find that potential interveners who have signed these pacts are less likely to intervene on behalf of rebel groups than non-allies, right? So this is an effective tool to keep your rebels from getting help. And in these papers, what we basically argue is there are concessions that governments can make to foreign powers to get them to commit to help the government or not help the rebels. So in this paper, what we're interested in is under what conditions can we expect a government who's facing a civil conflict, rather than making a deal with the rebels, right, rather than accommodating the rebels, to say what I'm going to try to do is accommodate those who are supporting the rebels. And so I contacted, and let me give you some motivating cases, some of the cases that made me think about this. So one of the first ones that made me think about this was the civil war in Mozambique. So in Mozambique, the Frelimo government was facing a conflict with Renamo rebels. Mozambique was one of the very anti-apartheid states in Africa, right? One of the frontline states who were strongly opposing apartheid and supporting the ANC. Well, South Africa was also supporting these Renamo rebels. As the conflict got tougher and the Mozambique government felt more threatened, what they ended up doing is making an Comedy agreement with South Africa in 1984, in which Mozambique agreed to stop supporting the ANC in return for South Africa stopping support for Renamo. Now, South Africa didn't completely stop supporting Renamo, but their support definitely went down. There was actually a debate between the civilian and military aspects of the government about what to do here. But in 1986, and so what they were doing was funneling their support through Malawi and Comoros so that it would be less obvious. In 1986, Mozambique was able to make an agreement with Malawi, giving them some economic benefits, trade benefits, in order to stop supporting the rebels. And that really made things very difficult for the rebels in Mozambique and led to the end of the war. In the Philippines, there was a claim by the Philippines on the Sabah region, which was controlled by Malaysia. Malaysia was supporting the MNLF, which was a rebel group in the southern part of the Philippines. And in 1973, when this conflict got tough, the Philippines offered to drop this territorial claim in return for Malaysia ending support to the MNLF. So these were a couple of the motivating cases that made me ask, why is it that sometimes you would think it's better to make this international agreement than to accommodate the rebels? So in all these cases, what we observe is that there's a separate issue that's under dispute between the third-party intervener and the government. And so the government has this choice. When can they bargain with the rebels and when would they bargain with the external intervener? And I think of this as a broader question about when we'll see what many call a separate peace. So whenever a coalition is fighting together, whether it's a bunch of rebel groups, whether it's rebel groups in external states, or whether it's states in a multinational international conflict, coalitions are vulnerable to splitting, right? And one of the things an opponent might want to do is peel off members of the coalition that will make it easier for them to win. So rather than accommodating all the members of the coalition, you figure out if you can accommodate some of the members of the coalition enough that it makes the coalition not that viable in fighting you. So we think of this as a broader concept. So I am not a game theorist. And so I reached out to Scott Walford, who is a game theorist, and said, hey, I've got this idea. You're someone who really studies coalition wars, right? And so let's think about this general model of a separate peace. So in the model, as you know, there are three actors. There's a government, there are rebels, and there's a third party. And a key component is that we have two issues, a domestic issue and an international issue. Each of the government and the third party care both about the domestic and the international issue, whereas the rebels only care at this point about the domestic issue. They're just trying to win control at this point. And the government and the third party, it's flexible how much they care about what we call their primary issue, which for the government is the domestic issue and the third party is the international issue, versus their secondary issue. But they can have whatever values they want on those two things. So as you would expect, support by the third party increases the rebels' probability of victory, right? We represent this by a high probability versus a low probability. How much it influences it is variable. Victory in the domestic conflict, as is normal, means that the victor gets their preferred outcome on the domestic issue. But also, if there is a settlement on domestic issues, Y gets resolved by a new international bargaining with new power relations between the government and the third party intervener. This is a complete information model. The government makes simultaneous offers, and what matters for that is not that they actually happen at the same time, but the idea that the rebels and the third party have to make independent decisions about whether to accept these offers. We think that even for coalition partners, there's not usually a lot of trust in terms of sharing all this information. And so they each have to decide whether to accept or reject that offer. The outcome can be a settlement. It can be a settlement in which there's no further war, right? Or there can be a bilateral war continuing where the international partner accepts the settlement and the domestic partner doesn't. Or there can be a multilateral war continuing where all three parties continue to fight. So here are some of what we think are the interesting results. So the first result is that even under complete information, and those of you who have studied sort of Fearon's bargaining model of war know that when you have inefficiencies in war, which we do here, you should never get war in complete information, right? There has to be some reason that you would get war in complete information. The reason that you get war in complete information here is because the domestic settlement is going to influence the international bargaining, and that can create additional inefficiencies. So basically what happens here is the intervener cares about who rules domestically enough, and the government cares enough about the international issue that they continue fighting this domestic war because no one is willing to settle without winning on the issue that they care about. Basically, the expected shift in power, if you ended the domestic war, is larger than the bargaining surplus that you get from continuing to fight. And so this validates sort of the David Cunningham has arguments, he has a book and an article where he talks about the fact that you add more parties, it gets harder to solve wars. So here's a case in which, yes, even under complete information, because people care about different things and everybody's worried about what happens if they accept a deal, we end up with more fighting. The second result is the classic issue linkage kind of result, which is that if the government doesn't value the international issue too highly, and especially also if the third party doesn't value the domestic issue too highly, you can trade off these issues and end up with a separate piece. So basically the government gives concessions on something it cares less about, the international issue, in order to convince the third party to stop supporting the rebels. The third result is a case in which basically the government escalates the domestic war, doesn't settle the domestic war, in order to increase the costs to the third party, so the third party will exit, right? So this is a case in which the intervener doesn't care that much about the domestic settlement. The government doesn't want to make the concessions on the international issue. And so what they really want to do is fight the domestic issue, make it too costly for the third party to continue. And so often what this involves is some kind of shock that changes the third party's calculus, because their commitment to this for the domestic population was always relatively hesitant. So we can't test all these propositions directly. And so what we do in terms of evidence is think about two things. First of all, we decided to investigate a particular case that we thought might demonstrate some of might elucidate some of the causal mechanisms in our theory as sort of a plausibility probe of the mechanisms. And so, as you know, we look at the civil war in Chad. So Chad, similar to other states in the region like Sudan, had a situation where during colonialism, Chad was a French colony. There's a Black Christian community in the South that was more closely aligned to the French. And there's an Arab Muslim community in the North that was less aligned with the French. And so upon independence, the government in Chad, it was led by a man called Tombo Bey, the Arabs in the North revolted against this. He was ruling very much in favor of the Southern Black Christians. So at that point, kings ruled many of the surrounding countries. And basically, their attitude was, let's all just leave each other alone. If we don't intervene in their conflict, they might not intervene in my conflict. But in 1969, there was a big shock to that regional system when Muammar Gaddafi took control in Libya. And he had very different views. He wanted to support the Arab rebels in Chad. Chad, of course, is a neighboring country to Libya. He had ideological goals for this. First of all, he believed strongly in pan-Arabism. He wanted to support Arab rule in the region. Secondly, he did not like that Chad was a supporter of Israel, primarily because they depended on support from France and the US. So he wanted to get rid of all the Zionist supporters and thought the Arab government would be more favorable on that. And he also had designs on the Aouzou Strip, which is this area between Chad and Libya that was controlled by Chad, which he believed had important uranium deposits. So he starts supporting the Arab rebels in Chad a lot. So the Arab rebels are doing well. And what that leads to, Frolinat is the rebels, that leads to the Chadian government, Tombo Bay, engaging in negotiations. They actually met in Tripoli. They were having serious negotiations about peace. The guy up here is the Derde, who was one of the spiritual leaders. And the idea was that they would allow him to come back to provide some autonomy to the region. It wasn't going to give the Arabs control of the state, but there were a lot of advantages to the Arabs in this deal. The deal was spoiled by Libya, who supposedly were the allies of the rebels. They engaged in an assassination attempt on Tombo Bay to end the negotiations. Our argument, based on our model, is that Libya was concerned that if this resolution went through, they would lose all leverage on the international issues that they cared about. So the negotiations break down. Tombo Bay is more convinced than ever that these are a threat to his rule, even if they were going to make this agreement. But just a year and a half later, in 1972, Chad and Libya signed a treaty of friendship. There were several agreements in this treaty. Libya agreed to stop supporting the northern rebels, the Frolinat rebels. They also agreed to provide a lot of aid to Chad. At the same time, Chad agreed to stop supporting Israel, not to recognize Israel. And while it wasn't written in the treaty, Gaddafi later claimed there was a secret agreement as well, which I think a lot of people induced from looking at what happened. Shortly after this, Libya began operations in the Aouzou Strip, and Chad didn't object. So it seems likely that there was some agreement for Libya to control the Aouzou Strip. So this was a separate piece that gave Libya what it wanted internationally in return for not supporting the rebels. So what changed? Why is it that Libya decided to take this separate piece rather than to continue supporting the rebels and try to get everything? Well, in the interim, there was a severe drought in Chad. And importantly, this drought affected the northern areas of the country much more severely than it affected the southern areas of the country. Remember, the rebels are in the north. And so what happened was this strongly affected the rebels' power and their ability to fight the government. So this changed both the government and Libya's expectations about the probability that the rebels could win the domestic conflict. So it made more sense, we think, for Libya to say, okay, I'm not going to win everything, so I'm better off taking the leverage that I can get and getting the international issue at this point. Meanwhile, Tombo Bay was saying, look, if I can get rid of this support, that's going to make a huge difference. Now, people who know African history know this wasn't the end of the war in the long run, but it did end. Abbas Siddiq was the person who was the Libyan connection who was in charge of Frolinat, and he ended up losing power. There were factional conflicts within the rebels. And so the Libyan-oriented opposition definitely lost a lot of power when Libya stepped out. So we also want to think about whether this is a generalizable claim, not just that we can come up with a case that seems to be illustrated well by the logic of our model. So it's a rich model. We can't test everything in it. And to be clear, what we're doing here is not measuring things in the model directly, but we're thinking about what evidence is suggestive of that we should continue to update positively about the theory in the model. So we know that the separate piece equilibrium is most likely to happen when the government and the third-party intervener have different priorities, right? And so we started to think about what are the kinds of things that we could observe that we think could affect that. We can't observe anybody's utility functions, right? But that should be associated with this. So what we did is we started by creating a set of cases that we think represent the scope conditions of the theory. So they had to be cases where civil war was ongoing and where the rebels were getting some kind of external support. And then the dependent variable that we want to know. So each case in this analysis is a conflict intervener dyad, right? So it's not yearly data. There's a data for each conflict. There's a line for each conflict, but there is a separate line for each independent intervener. About a third of the cases only have one intervener, but some cases do have more than one intervener. And then our dependent variable is whether there's an agreement for non-aggression, whether they make a commitment to stop attacking each other. These non-aggression agreements often include very broad promises about what actions people will and will not take to support rebels. So we consider agreements that promise non-aggression but don't include other kinds of alliance commitments. They have to be signed after the start of the intervention, and they can't be signed after the conclusion of the conflict because that wouldn't be a separate piece, that would just be a piece. Based on our data sources, our temporal domain is 1975 to 2017. And during that period, we have about 300 cases and about 50 of them have these separate piece agreements. It's 14% of the cases end in a separate piece. So I always like to start just looking at crosstabs, right? You should be able to see your story just in these very simple crosstabs. So the first thing we thought is, how would we know whether there's a separate issue that the third-party intervener probably cares a lot about? As you saw in the paper, we talk a lot about what motivates intervention. And there's some interventions that are motivated because people really care about who rules that state. But other interventions are motivated because of a common enemy. We both hate the government, right? And so, we use Thompson's perceptual measure of rivalry, and we only include cases here when the rivalry existed before the intervention. Those are cases where we think it captures these other disputes that were in existence before the conflict happened. And what you can see is that agreements, these separate peace agreements, are much more likely when the intervener is a rival of the government. Now, I think if I had walked into the lobby of the Peace Science Society Association meeting and said, everybody, how many people think rivals are more likely to make agreements than non-rivals? People would say no, right? They wouldn't think that's true. And so we see this as a counterintuitive finding, but one that makes sense in the context of our model. Secondly, we look and see where is the government going to be particularly concerned about this internal conflict? Where are they going to be so concerned that they might be willing to make compromises on international issues, even if they're international issues they care about? And we thought, if we believe that governments really care about staying in power, they should feel more threatened when the aim of the rebels is control of the central government than when the aim of the rebels is some kind of territorial autonomy. So again, we find that agreements are much more likely when the rebels are center-seeking. So we don't just rely on those crosstabs. We recognize there are other variables that could matter. So the first column in each of these is just the bivariate regression. We then add contiguity because contiguous states, of course, are likely to do all these things. And then we add some other variables that we think might be post-treatment. So there's debate about whether they should be included or not. But the idea is everything's robust. As you could see from those crosstabs, right? I mean, there was a really obvious relationship. And so in both cases, both for center-seeking rebels and for rivals, we see separate peace is more likely. In fact, there's a 360% increase in the mean probability of separate peace with a rival compared to a non-rival, and 125% increase for government-seeking rebels versus territory-seeking. This part isn't in the paper. We do have a robustness check where we have an alternative measure of separate peace. This is data that was collected by Ken Schultz he had a 2010 article on government third-party agreements to end support for rebels. It's a much smaller set of cases, so it's not really conducive to regression analysis and things like that. But we went through all of these to see which ones qualify as non-aggression pacts, and many of them do, but many of them are kind of short of that kind of promise, but still promise less support for rebels. So we thought it was a good robustness check. And again, the same really strong relationship, much more likely among rivals and much more likely when the rebels seek government control. So I think there's a whole set of takeaways from this, both for this specific question and then for some other things as well. First of all, it's not always the case that more actors make a bargain solution less likely. There are conditions under which more actors make a bargain solution less likely, and there are conditions under which more actors caring about different things open the way for some settlement of some parts of the conflict, maybe not all parts of the conflict. Secondly, sponsoring rebels is a tool that states can use in advancing their international interests, and they do it a lot, right? We can name lots of cases in which states were clearly trying to advance their international interests when they were getting involved in civil wars. They might want to weaken their rival, they might just want to be a pest, but I think that in that case, rebels need to worry about abandonment, right? They need to recognize that they don't have a perfect alignment of interest with their supporters. This doesn't mean necessarily that they shouldn't take the support. There are lots of instances in which even if you think the support isn't going to last, even if you know that there are different interests, you're better off with the support, even when your interests aren't aligned, if it gives you more arms and money and training and logistics and things like that, then you should do that. The other thing on a policy stance is for people outside who are thinking about how do we manage this conflict, right? What you don't want to see is that conflicts are continuing due to inefficiencies, right? If you think about a game theoretic term. So we said, look, these other issues are making people not settle a conflict that they would otherwise settle. And so one role that the international community can play is take that off the table, provide international guarantees, for instance, on some international issue and say, resolve your domestic conflict. We're not going to let them take this international issue from you because you're weaker as a result of that or something like that. So I think that there are new kind of policy recommendations about how you might either encourage these kinds of deals or prevent these kinds of international issues from derailing conflict settlement domestically. But I also have some broader takeaways. The first is, I think that we need to be even more aware of the domestic uses of foreign policy. And I think a lot of the early discussion about the domestic uses of foreign policy was about public opinion. So we would hear about diversionary conflict, wagging the dog, things like that. For domestic politics, people might do things internationally, focused on advanced democracies. Well, in fact, I think that the connections between domestic and international politics are way broader, and that it's one of the areas in which governments have so much advantage over others and so much independent control that when we think about vote buying in international organizations, when we think about foreign aid, there's so many things that governments do that, in foreign policy that are aimed at keeping themselves in power domestically. And I think people are starting to do a lot more work on that, particularly among autocratic states. The other thing is I do think that this model puts us on a path toward a general model of separate peace. And as you saw in the conclusion of the paper, we talk about cases, we talked about the Myanmar as one example, but civil wars with multiple rebel groups where governments may try to separate these rebel groups from each other by making separate pieces, and also interstate conflicts with coalitions. I mean, this is exactly what Putin was trying to do with Trump, right? To say, what I want to do is make a deal with you for you not to support Ukraine anymore, right? I mean, Russia knows that they're going to be more successful in Ukraine if they can get the Westerners to stop supporting Ukraine. And so that was one attempt there. So we think that this is a broader phenomenon in international politics as well. So that's all I had planned, and I look forward to taking your questions. Thanks,
Great.
everybody.
Thank you. Those good questions. To get on the list, put up your hand anytime. If you have an immediate follow-on on a question that's just been asked, put up 2 fingers. I'll bump you up the queue. Use it sparingly. Sabrina, I have you first.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Ashley. I have to run. because-
Okay.
Yes, but so I wanted to go first. And I just wanted to thank you for coming,
Thanks.
obviously, and sharing this super interesting new project